When a billionaire opened his door to a foster child in the middle of a storm, he expected disruption, not redemption. But the blanket he gave her became the thread that bound them into a family. The rain came down in steady sheets, racing down the tall glass walls of Adrian Vale's mansion, blurring the view of the world beyond. Inside, the lights glowed with soft precision, warm yet controlled, every room arranged to match the order of the man who lived there. Adrian sat in his study, a fire burning low beside rows of books and the quiet hum of machines that ran his biotech empire, even while he rested. To him, this house was both a sanctuary and a fortress, proof that control could keep chaos away. He never expected anyone to arrive unannounced, least of all in a storm like this. Yet the knock came, faint at first, then louder, echoing through the long halls, until he frowned and rose from his chair. At the gate stood a woman in a raincoat, her clipboard pressed against her chest to shield it from the water. Beside her was a thin girl holding a small backpack, her dark hair plastered to her cheeks, her shoes soaked through. The social worker raised her voice over the storm, introducing herself and explaining quickly that there had been an emergency, that the girl needed immediate placement, that Adrian had been on the list as a possible foster parent. The explanation was efficient, hurried, and left little space for refusal. Adrian felt irritation rise. The timing was impossible, his life too structured for surprises. Yet the girl's eyes, wide and silent, anchored him in place. The gates opened, and soon they were in the grand entryway, where polished stone reflected the glow of the chandelier above. Water dripped from their coats, forming small puddles on the floor, and Adrian gestured for towels. The social worker spoke in professional tones, reciting details about the girl's background. Her name, Eliza, 9 years old, several placements already, no stable relatives available. Each word was factual, cold in its delivery. But behind the facts, Adrian sensed a weight, the kind of weight that came from too many disappointments in too few years. Eliza herself said nothing, her arms wrapped tightly around her backpack, her shoulders hunched as though she expected to be sent away at any moment. When the social worker finally left, the silence grew heavier. Adrian stood across the vast room from the girl, uncertain of what to do next. He was used to running companies, not comforting children. Yet he saw her shivering, the rain still clinging to her skin. And without thinking, he went to the linen closet and pulled out a wool blanket. He returned and placed it gently around her shoulders. She looked up at him then, not with gratitude expressed in words, but with eyes that softened slightly, as though the gesture meant more than anything spoken could. Adrian realized in that small moment that his house, for all its wealth and precision, had never truly sheltered anyone until now. The storm outside raged on, but within those walls, something unexpected had begun. Adrian stood in the wide entryway, the marble floor gleaming beneath the chandelier, and for a moment he felt as though he were looking at a ghost. The child was so small, her thin arms wrapped around that worn backpack, her clothes damp from the storm that had driven her here. She did not cry, did not speak, only shivered in silence, as if she had learned long ago that showing fear brought no comfort. Adrian, a man who solved problems with contracts and numbers, felt an unfamiliar pause inside himself. He had expected a polite word of thanks when he opened his home, perhaps a timid smile, but instead there was only this watchful quiet. He turned away, unsettled by how much it stirred him, and walked into his study where the scent of old books and cedar filled the air. His hand moved almost without thought, pulling down a heavy wool blanket from the back of his leather chair. When he returned, Eliza had not moved. She stood in the same place, her shoes dripping slowly onto the marble, her gaze fixed somewhere past him as though she might vanish if she blinked. Adrian bent slightly, awkward in the gesture, and placed the blanket over her shoulders. For a heartbeat, she froze, rigid and uncertain. Then her hands lifted to hold it tight against herself. The fabric swallowed her frame, its weight far larger than the child beneath it. But the way she clutched it told him all he needed to know. She did not say thank you. She did not smile. Yet the way her fingers dug into the folds, the way she pulled it close around her chin, spoke more than words ever could. He straightened, watching her with a detachment he pretended was still intact, but something shifted inside. He had spent years surrounding himself with walls of glass and steel, believing comfort came from security systems and precise order. But this silent girl revealed how little warmth had ever existed in these rooms. He gestured toward the staircase, leading her up to the guest room prepared hastily by the staff. She followed without complaint, her bare steps soundless on the carpeted halls, the blanket trailing behind, like a shield she refused to lower. In the room she set her backpack carefully on the nightstand, as if it contained treasures too fragile to touch. She sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulders still wrapped tight, her eyes darting to every corner of the space. Adrian lingered in the doorway longer than he meant to, watching the way she seemed both ready to flee and desperate to stay. He thought of boardrooms where silence was strategy, where hesitation meant weakness, but here, silence was something else entirely. It was history written in a child's posture, a story of promises broken too many times. He closed the door softly, leaving her with the blanket, knowing it had already done more than he could manage with any words. The guest room was wide and filled with light, the kind of space most adults would envy, yet to Eliza it felt like another test. The walls were painted in soft ivory, the curtains drawn back to reveal tall windows that looked out across the rain-swept gardens, and the bed stood high with a carved headboard and a mountain of pillows stacked neatly in a way that seemed too perfect to touch. She stepped inside slowly, her small shoes leaving faint marks on the rug, and she carried her backpack as if it were heavier than it looked. Adrian followed a few paces behind, his presence filling the doorway, his hand resting against the polished frame as though uncertain whether to enter. Eliza moved with care, scanning the room in quick glances, her eyes catching on details most would ignore: the polished desk, the silver lamp, the wardrobe that seemed taller than she was. She did not drop her things onto the floor as a child might have. Instead, she placed her backpack on the nightstand, gently, almost reverently, and unzipped it with the quiet precision of someone who knew how to live out of a bag. From it, she drew only 3 items: a small notebook with worn edges, a faded stuffed rabbit missing one ear, and a plastic bracelet with chipped paint. She arranged them side by side on the nightstand, each one straightened carefully, until they looked as if they belonged there, though the contrast against the expensive furniture was stark. The blanket remained wrapped around her shoulders, its heavy wool nearly swallowing her frame, yet she held it with a grip that refused to loosen. It was not comfort she sought, not warmth alone, but a shield, an armor against a house that looked too grand to ever be safe. Adrian saw this as he stood silently, his dark eyes following her every move, and he realized with a jolt that she had not spoken a single word since she entered his home. She had answered no questions, offered no gratitude, yet she was speaking in another way, in how she handled her few belongings, in how she looked at the door, as if expecting it to close behind her forever. Adrian cleared his throat once, but the sound felt clumsy in the stillness. He wanted to tell her she could rest here, that the room was hers, that she was safe, yet the words caught in his chest. He was a man who negotiated billion-dollar contracts with ease, who could command entire teams with a single sentence. Yet here, in front of a 9-year-old girl, he found himself powerless. He stayed in the doorway, unwilling to break the fragile space she had carved out for herself. Eliza sat down carefully on the edge of the bed, her back straight, the blanket clutched close, and only then did she look at him. The look was not trust, not yet, but it was also not fear. It was the look of someone measuring whether she would be allowed to stay. The house had always been admired by visitors, a masterpiece of glass and stone built on the edge of the hills, its rooms designed for quiet precision, its hallways lined with art collected from across the world. To Adrian, it was a place of refuge after years of relentless work, a fortress where nothing moved without his permission, where every detail spoke of discipline and control. Yet now, as he walked through the long corridors, he became aware of something he had never noticed before. The silence was too sharp, the walls too bare of life, and the wealth that once felt like achievement now pressed against him with a hollowness he could not name. The staff moved as they always did, discreet and efficient, their footsteps muffled against polished floors. A chef prepared meals in a kitchen large enough to feed a banquet hall, guards stood at their posts near the gates, and an assistant delivered files for the next morning's meeting. Everything ran as it always had, smooth and perfect. Yet tonight, he heard something different, the faint sound of small footsteps echoing through the house, lighter than any of the staff, hesitant but present. Eliza's presence unsettled him, not in a way that was unwelcome, but in a way that revealed how empty the house had always been before she arrived. He passed by the library and noticed the blanket she carried trailing slightly as she walked ahead of him, her frame swallowed by its folds, her head turning to take in the shelves stacked with books she could never reach. She did not ask questions, she did not speak, but her eyes lingered on each detail, her gaze mapping a space that had been built for efficiency rather than warmth. Adrian realized she was the only child who had ever stepped foot in this place, and suddenly the grand design felt unbalanced. The rooms too large for one man, the silence too heavy for comfort. At dinner, the table stretched out between them like a gulf. The chef had prepared salmon with delicate sides, the kind of dish Adrian rarely thought about, but ate out of habit. Eliza sat across from him, her small hands folded around the silverware, her shoulders still wrapped in the blanket, as though it were armor. She ate carefully, not greedily, but with the patience of someone who understood food could not be wasted. Adrian found himself watching her more than his own plate, noticing how every sound of the fork against porcelain seemed magnified in the vast room. Later, as he walked through the empty halls once more, he heard her soft steps behind him. They were not intrusive. They did not break his order, but they reminded him that for the first time in years he was not alone. The mansion that had once been a monument to his success now revealed its truth. It was cavernous, beautiful, and hollow, until a child's quiet footsteps gave it weight and meaning. Eliza moved through the house like a shadow, quiet and careful, her eyes taking in details most people ignored. At breakfast, she sat with her back straight, eating slowly, her hands steady as she cut small pieces of food and chewed without noise. Adrian thought her silence came from shyness or fear, but what he did not see was how her gaze flicked from the staff at the doors to the guard who adjusted the panel near the entryway, memorizing the order of the buttons pressed into the keypad. She did not stare openly, only glanced once, then lowered her eyes to her plate, storing the sequence in her memory. To her, every movement in the house was a clue, every habit of the adults, a pattern that might matter later. Her notebook was always close, tucked in the pocket of her backpack, or under the fold of the blanket she carried with her from room to room. Its cover was bent, its pages filled with cramped handwriting and small sketches. When Adrian passed by her doorway one evening, he saw her hunched over it, the pencil moving in quick strokes, her face set in concentration. He assumed she was writing stories or drawing the way children sometimes did. Yet inside the notebook, she was keeping a record, lists of names and codes, sketches of the layout of hallways, notations about when doors were locked or left open. It was not a game for her. It was the way she understood the world, the way she protected herself against surprises that had hurt too many times before. Adrian often mistook her watchfulness for unease. At dinner, he tried small questions, asking about school, about favorite subjects, about friends, but she only shrugged or gave one-word answers. Her eyes lowered. He thought she was afraid to speak, that perhaps she felt intimidated by the size of the house or the distance between them. What he did not realize was that her silence was not fear at all. It was calculation. She was measuring the way he spoke, the way his voice softened when he addressed her, the way he tapped his fingers lightly on the table when distracted. She was storing these signs in the same way she stored the keypad numbers, building a map of the man who had taken her in, uncertain if he was a protector or just another temporary guardian who might vanish. One afternoon, as he worked in his study, he caught her standing near the window, her eyes fixed on the gardens below. He thought she was daydreaming, but when he asked what she saw, she replied softly that 2 guards had switched posts earlier than usual, that one had looked nervous, and that the security light near the north fence had been flickering for 3 nights. Her voice carried no drama, only fact, and then she returned to her notebook without explanation. Adrian sat back, startled by the sharpness of her observation, realizing too late that her quiet eyes missed nothing, and that in her silence she was already protecting both of them. The sound of heels against marble carried through the hall before Sabrina appeared, her figure framed by the tall glass doors, her smile polished to perfection. She moved with the kind of grace that belonged to magazine covers, her hair shining under the chandelier, a bottle of imported wine in one hand, and a silk scarf draped across the other arm, as if she had just stepped away from a photo shoot. Adrian rose from the sofa, his expression softening as it often did when she entered a room, and he greeted her with a brief kiss that she returned with practiced warmth. She spoke of a dinner party they had been invited to, of friends who wanted to invest in his new project, her words bright and flowing, as if life around her was always sparkling. Eliza was seated in the corner chair, her notebook hidden beneath the blanket, wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Sabrina noticed her then, letting out a delighted laugh, and reached into her designer bag. From it, she produced an expensive toy, a small electronic device with flashing lights, the kind of gift that would have thrilled most children. She presented it with a flourish, her smile wide, her voice pitched in that sweet tone adults often used with the young, as if charm could erase the gap between strangers. Eliza did not reach for it. Her eyes flicked to Adrian, then back to Sabrina, before she gave the smallest of nods, a gesture polite enough not to be called rude, yet distant enough to show she was not fooled. The toy sat untouched on the coffee table, its lights blinking like a signal ignored. Adrian noticed something he had not before. Eliza shifted slightly, pulling the blanket higher around her face until only her eyes were visible, as though hiding behind its folds made her invisible. It was a small movement, easy to miss, but he saw it clearly. Whenever Sabrina leaned closer, Eliza shrank back, her hands tightening on the wool as though it were armor. Adrian felt a flicker of confusion, then curiosity. Eliza was cautious with everyone, that much he had learned, but this was different. This was not the watchful silence she gave to his staff or the guards. It was something sharper, a quiet mistrust directed only at Sabrina. The evening moved forward with conversation and polished laughter. Sabrina pouring the wine and telling stories of her travels, her hand brushing Adrian's arm as she leaned in, her smile flashing with every word. Adrian responded, as he always did, calm and attentive, yet his eyes drifted to the corner where Eliza Saturday. She had not touched the toy, had not joined in the talk, and each time Sabrina laughed, the blanket tightened again around her shoulders. Adrian found himself distracted, his thoughts circling back to the child who seemed to sense something he could not yet name. When Sabrina finally rose to leave, promising to return soon with plans for their weekend, Eliza's grip loosened, and for the first time that evening, she exhaled. Adrian stood in the silent room, unsettled, realizing that his fiancée's smile did not reach every heart. The study was quiet, except for the low hum of the fireplace and the tapping of Adrian's fingers against the keyboard. It was nearly midnight, yet his mind refused to rest, circling figures and formulas, chasing projections across glowing screens. He leaned back in his chair, fatigue pulling at him, when a faint sound at the door drew his attention. He turned and saw Eliza standing there, her small frame half hidden by the wood, her bare feet pale against the dark floor, the blanket trailing from her shoulders like a shadow. Her eyes were wide, alert in a way that carried no trace of sleep. Adrian frowned softly and gestured for her to come in. She crossed the room quietly, every step careful, and stopped at his side without sitting. He expected her to ask for water or to admit she could not sleep, but instead she leaned closer, so close he felt her breath near his ear, and whispered words that froze him in place. She said she had seen Sabrina in his office that afternoon, not simply looking around, but holding a small device and photographing the documents on his desk. The whisper was barely more than air, yet its meaning was heavy. For a long moment Adrian stared at her, uncertain whether to believe. The image of Sabrina, glamorous and devoted, did not fit with the accusation spoken in a child's fragile voice. He asked when, and Eliza answered clearly, saying the sun was still high, that Sabrina had not noticed her standing in the hallway. She described how Sabrina had opened his folder with gloved fingers, how she had tilted the papers toward the light, how she had smiled faintly before tucking the device away. Adrian shook his head, telling himself the girl must have misunderstood. Sabrina often came by. Sabrina liked to surprise him. Sabrina had no reason to betray him. Yet even as he formed the excuses, unease settled inside him like ice. Eliza watched him with steady eyes, no trace of doubt in her face. She did not argue when he said perhaps Sabrina was simply tidying or admiring his work, but her silence pressed against him harder than any protest could have. She pulled the blanket closer and whispered again, softer this time, that Sabrina had done it before, that she always chose moments when Adrian was away or on the phone, that Eliza had been watching because something about Sabrina never felt right. Then she stepped back, her small shoulders tense, as if bracing for disbelief. Adrian wanted to dismiss it, to restore the comfort of certainty, but the whisper lingered in the quiet of the study long after she slipped away. He turned back to his desk, the fire crackling faintly, and stared at the folder Sabrina had touched earlier that day. His chest tightened with doubt he could not ignore, and though he told himself there had to be an explanation, a single truth remained. Eliza had no reason to lie. The house was silent in the early hours, the kind of silence that felt heavier than sleep, and Adrian moved through the halls with a careful step. He told himself he was only restless, that work had pulled him from bed, yet deep inside he knew the reason was Eliza's whisper. Her words had settled into his mind like a grain of sand, small but sharp, impossible to ignore. Sabrina had been in his office, she had touched his files, she had photographed them. It sounded absurd, yet he had built his fortune on never dismissing what others overlooked. And tonight, he would see for himself. The study door opened with a quiet click, and the faint glow of the security light spilled across the polished floor. Adrian stepped inside, his eyes drawn immediately to the desk, where he always left his work in precise order. He stopped, his breath catching, because something was wrong. The file at the center, one he had reviewed the night before, lay slightly askew, its corner not aligned with the rest. To anyone else it would have been invisible. But Adrian's life was measured in details, and this was a detail out of place. He moved closer, his hand brushing over the folder, and saw faint smudges on the glossy surface, the kind left by fingertips even when gloves were worn. His chest tightened as he turned his gaze toward the edge of the desk, where a glass rested. It was one of his crystal tumblers, but he had not poured a drink in it. He leaned down, the light catching the rim, and saw the mark clear as day, a faint curve of red lipstick. His mind supplied the image without effort. Sabrina's mouth painted in that shade she favored, the color she wore when she wanted to be unforgettable. For the first time, doubt cracked through his trust, sharp and unwelcome. He remembered the curve of her smile, the ease of her laughter, the way she leaned into him as if he were the only man she saw. Yet now, he saw her in another way, standing in his office with his files tilted toward a hidden lens, her lips stained red as she sipped from a glass she never should have touched. His pulse hammered as he tried to summon another explanation. Perhaps she had left it absent-mindedly. Perhaps she had only admired the folder. Perhaps Eliza had misread the moment, but the excuses felt brittle. He stood in the dim study for a long time, the glass cold in his hand, the file mocking him with its slight shift, and realized that the world he had built around Sabrina's presence might not be as steady as he believed. Eliza's whisper had not been the fantasy of a frightened child. It had been warning. The storm of doubt grew louder in his chest, and as he placed the glass back on the desk, he understood he could no longer ignore the evidence in the dark. The alarm shattered the night without warning, a sharp shriek that echoed through Adrian's phone before the automated system cut through, with a clipped voice announcing a breach at his downtown lab. He was out of bed in seconds, pulling on his coat, his heart racing with the knowledge that the lab was the core of his empire. Every prototype, every guarded secret of his company lived behind those doors, and an alarm meant risk he could not ignore. The streets blurred as he drove, rain streaking against the windshield, his thoughts turning in circles between Eliza's warning whispers and the lipstick-stained glass still etched in his memory. By the time he reached the lab, the air was sharp with the lingering cry of the sirens, the lights flashing in harsh rhythm across the sleek glass walls. Inside, the building seemed untouched at first glance, the guards shifting nervously as he strode past. Adrian demanded access to the control room, his voice clipped, his authority absolute. The security logs appeared on screen within moments, neat rows of timestamps and codes, but something about them was wrong. The sequence was too clean, too polished, as though someone had erased the mess that reality always left behind. He leaned closer, scanning, and saw the gaps. Hours where no one had entered or left, yet he knew employees had been on shift. The lines had been altered, overwritten with patterns too precise. This was no accident. It was intrusion disguised as order. The weight of it pressed against him, yet before he could speak, a small voice broke the silence. Eliza stood in the doorway, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders even here, her notebook clutched tight against her chest. She looked out of place among the blinking monitors and uniformed guards, yet her eyes were steady. She said softly that she had known this would happen, that she had written it down. Confusion flickered across Adrian's face as she opened her notebook, the worn pages covered in lines of careful notes. She pointed to them with her small finger, showing him dates and times, the pattern she had tracked when Sabrina visited the house. Each visit matched with moments when strange signals appeared in the air, when lights flickered or systems slowed. Adrian took the book in his hands, his eyes running over the evidence she had collected with the discipline of a survivor. He felt a mix of pride and unease, realizing that while he had been blind to comfort, this child had been cataloging danger with every breath. Eliza said, Sabrina always acted sweet when she returned from the lab, her smile sharper, her questions more precise. Eliza had written it all down because she knew one day something would break. Adrian closed the notebook slowly, the sound of the alarm still echoing in his ears, and met Eliza's gaze. For the first time he admitted to himself that she might see more clearly than he did. The lab was intact, but his trust was fractured, and in the silence that followed he understood that nothing about this was coincidence. The rain had eased by morning, but the house still carried the heavy stillness of a storm that had not truly passed. Adrian sat at the long oak table, Eliza beside him with her notebook open, its pages filled with tight handwriting and sketches that looked more like the work of an investigator than a child. He turned the pages slowly, his jaw tight, and the unease inside him grew with every line. For years he had trusted the precision of his own instincts, yet here was proof that a 9-year-old had seen what he had missed. The weight of it pushed him to seek someone who had always stood quietly at the edges of his life. Josephine, the housekeeper, who had been with his family since before his parents were gone. Josephine entered the room without surprise, her posture straight, her silver hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, her eyes calm but sharp. Adrian dismissed the staff with a nod, leaving only the three of them in the quiet space. He explained what Eliza had told him about the camera behind the painting, the glass on his desk, the altered security logs, and Sabrina's presence where she should not have been. As he spoke, Josephine's expression did not shift in shock, and when he finished, she folded her hands and said simply that she too had noticed. She had seen Sabrina moving through the house in early hours, claiming to be restless, but standing by his office door instead of the library. She had overheard phone calls held in hushed tones from the driveway, Sabrina's voice sharper than the sweet lilt she used inside. Eliza leaned forward, her blanket slipping down her shoulders, and asked Josephine what else she had seen. The older woman's eyes softened as she looked at the child, recognizing in her the same careful vigilance she herself had practiced for years. She said Sabrina had always seemed too curious about the household routines, asking about delivery schedules, about when guards switched shifts, questions no guest would need to know. Josephine had kept silent at first, believing it was not her place. But now, with Eliza's notes spread before them, she understood it was part of something larger. Together they began piecing the fragments into a clearer picture, Josephine adding her quiet observations to Eliza's precise records, Adrian listening with the intensity of a man who realized his world had cracks he had never considered. They marked the dates of Sabrina's visits, compared them to the disturbances in his lab systems, traced the times when documents had gone missing only to reappear later. Each piece fit with unsettling ease, forming not accidents but a pattern of deliberate betrayal. Adrian looked from Josephine's lined, steady face to Eliza's solemn eyes and felt the weight of their trust pressing on him. The house no longer felt like a fortress but a stage where someone had been acting a part. For the first time, he accepted that he could not face it alone. He had allies now, unexpected ones, and together they would uncover the truth that had been hiding in shadow. The day had stretched long and heavy, filled with whispered conversations and tense discoveries, the kind of day that left even Adrian's sharp mind drained. He had spent hours with Josephine and Eliza, piecing together fragments of information that pointed to betrayal deeper than he had ever allowed himself to imagine. Eliza had carried her notebook everywhere, flipping pages with quick fingers, tracing patterns in her small, careful script, her eyes dark with focus. She was only 9, yet she carried herself with the discipline of someone who had learned survival too young. By evening her shoulders sagged, though she refused to admit she was tired. Adrian noticed the way her pencil slowed, her head nodding forward, her body fighting against the pull of sleep. They were in the library when exhaustion finally caught her. Eliza sat curled in one of the armchairs, her notebook slipping from her lap to the carpet, her chin resting against her knees. Adrian was in the middle of a sentence when he realized she was no longer awake, her breathing soft and even, her lashes dark against her cheeks. For a moment he simply looked at her, struck by how small she appeared in the wide chair, how fragile against the weight of everything she had carried on her narrow shoulders. His heart tightened with something he could not quite name. Quietly he rose, crossing to her side, and retrieved the wool blanket that had become her shield. He had left it draped over the back of the sofa earlier, and as he lifted it, now the familiar weight settled across his hands. Carefully he leaned down and spread it over her, tucking it gently around her frame. She stirred faintly, curling deeper into the warmth, her fingers brushing against the edge of the fabric as though searching for it even in sleep. Adrian stood still, watching that instinctive gesture, and felt the realization settle. This blanket was no longer simply comfort against cold, no longer an object he had handed her on a stormy night. It had become a bond, a thread between them, proof that she trusted him enough to rest. He lowered himself into the chair across from her, the firelight flickering against the rows of books, and let his thoughts drift. In boardrooms he was known for precision, for never missing a detail, yet it had taken a child's quiet vigilance to open his eyes to dangers he had ignored. She had warned him, she had watched for him, and now, asleep and vulnerable, she entrusted him to watch for her. He understood then that responsibility was no longer a matter of guardianship on paper. It was something deeper, the fragile weight of her faith resting in his hands. As the hours passed, and the fire burned low, Adrian kept his place beside her. The mansion that had always felt empty now held meaning in its silence. A child slept safely under his roof, wrapped in a blanket that had become more than fabric. It was a promise. The evening began like so many others, with Sabrina arriving in a swirl of perfume and elegance, her laughter filling the marble entryway before she even reached the sitting room. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed charm could smooth every edge, her hair shining under the chandelier, her lips curved in that flawless smile Adrian had once trusted without question. She poured herself a glass of wine and settled gracefully onto the sofa, speaking about acquaintances who envied her, about upcoming galas, about how fortunate Adrian was to have her by his side. Her voice was smooth, but tonight, Adrian listened differently. He had Josephine's quiet words in his mind, and Eliza's notebook lay on his desk upstairs, each page heavy with observations that had become impossible to ignore. He asked questions gently at first, nothing that might seem like an interrogation, but enough to push her past the lines she had rehearsed. He asked if she remembered, when she first became interested in his research, how much she had followed the company's growth before they met, what she thought about the financing of his next expansion. For the briefest moment her smile froze, then returned, brighter and quicker than before. Adrian noticed only the pause, but Eliza, sitting silently near the window with her blanket pulled around her, noticed far more. She saw the tightness at the corners of Sabrina's mouth, the way her eyes flicked to the floor when finances were mentioned, the stiffness in her posture when she pretended to laugh. Sabrina leaned forward, brushing Adrian's arm as if to distract him, answering his questions with flattery rather than detail. She spoke of how proud she was of his achievements, how secure she felt knowing he was the best in his field. But when she touched on numbers, her tone thinned, her confidence slipping. Eliza watched every flicker with sharp focus, her pencil moving quietly across her notebook even as she kept her face blank. To anyone else, she seemed like a child scribbling, but Adrian had learned that every mark she made was deliberate. The room felt warmer as the fire crackled, yet an unease threaded through the air. Sabrina's charm no longer flowed as effortlessly, and Adrian found himself pressing again, asking about her visits during the day, her sudden interest in organizing his office, her habit of arriving with perfect timing when he worked late. She laughed at each question, dismissing them with practiced grace, but Eliza saw the calculation behind her eyes. The mask that had seemed seamless now carried cracks, faint but undeniable. When Sabrina excused herself to make a phone call, her smile still fixed in place, Eliza turned to Adrian. She whispered that the mask was slipping, that Sabrina's eyes had betrayed her even if her voice had not. Adrian looked at his ward, then toward the door. Sabrina had closed behind her, and for the first time he felt certain of what Eliza had been trying to tell him all along. Sabrina's time was running out, and she knew it. The house was quiet that night, the staff gone to their quarters, the lights dimmed to a soft glow across the wide halls. Adrian moved through the rooms with the weight of suspicion pressing at him, his mind restless after weeks of unease. He told himself he was only checking the locks, only walking off the tension that clung to his chest, yet something pulled him deeper into the lower levels of the house. The old wine cellar lay beneath the dining room, a place rarely visited except for special dinners, its stone walls lined with shelves of bottles collected over years. He descended the stairs slowly, the cool air rising around him, and paused when he heard voices. They were low, sharp, the kind of tones meant to remain hidden. He recognized them instantly. Sabrina's silky cadence now stripped of charm, and the steady, clipped voice of Miles, his chief financial officer, the man he had trusted since the first days of building his company. Adrian froze in the shadows, his hand tightening on the railing as their words carried through the stillness. Sabrina asked if the timeline would hold, if the final extraction would be ready by the end of the week. Miles answered without hesitation, saying everything was prepared, the accounts were secure, and once the files were delivered, Adrian would be finished. The sound of their betrayal was sharper than any blade. Adrian listened as Sabrina laughed softly, a laugh he had once thought belonged only to him, and said she would handle Adrian's questions a little longer, that he was beginning to suspect but still wanted to believe her. Miles replied that soon belief would no longer matter, that by the time Adrian understood fully, the damage would already be done. The words echoed in the cool cellar, confirming what Eliza had whispered late at night, what Josephine had warned, in quiet certainty. Adrian felt the ground shift beneath him. Every memory of Sabrina's smile, every late-night toast with Miles, every moment of trust, twisted into something poisonous. He saw clearly now how easily they had played their roles, one with affection, one with loyalty, both weaving deception so complete he had almost surrendered to it. He backed away from the stairwell, his breath unsteady, the truth pressing against his chest with crushing weight. When he returned upstairs, Eliza was waiting in the library, her notebook open on her lap, her blanket draped over her shoulders. She looked up at him with eyes that already knew the answer, as though she had been braced for this moment. Adrian sank into the chair opposite her, his voice rough as he told her she had been right. Sabrina and Miles were working together, planning something called final extraction, a plan meant to strip him of everything. Eliza did not gloat, did not smile in victory. She only nodded slowly, her small hand resting on the edge of her notebook. She had trusted her instincts when he had doubted, and now the betrayal stood plain before them both. The night stretched long, the house heavy with silence, after the truth Adrian had uncovered in the wine cellar. He sat at the great oak table in the library, the fire burning low, the weight of betrayal pressing on his shoulders. Sabrina's charm and Miles's loyalty had both been illusions, and the words final extraction echoed in his mind with the sharpness of a blade. He was a man used to control, yet now control had slipped from his grasp, and he could not see the path forward. Across from him, Eliza sat curled in her chair, her blanket draped like armor, her notebook open on her lap. Her pencil scratched steadily across the page, and when she looked up, her eyes were calm, focused, far older than her 9 years. She told him she had been thinking, that they could not simply wait for Sabrina and Miles to make their move, that they had to turn the plan back on them. Adrian asked what she meant. His tone measured, though his heart stirred with both doubt and curiosity. Eliza slid the notebook across the table, her handwriting small but clear, her lines of thought arranged like stepping stones. She said Sabrina had filled the house with surveillance, cameras behind paintings, microphones in vases, signals hidden in objects meant to look like gifts. Adrian had seen them as a threat, but Eliza said they could use them as tools. If those devices were feeding information to Sabrina and beyond, then they could also feed the wrong information, carefully crafted lies that would lead their enemies into a trap. Her plan was simple, yet precise. First, they would create false files, decoy documents placed in the office where Sabrina always searched, full of technical jargon and formulas convincing enough to pass. These files would carry invisible watermarks, signals that could trace their path once transmitted. Second, Adrian would stage calls about meetings that did not exist, letting Sabrina's devices capture every word. So when she passed the intelligence along, the timing would work against her. Third, they would monitor the signals directly, using her tablet to map where the transmissions went, exposing the entire chain instead of just the people inside his house. Adrian listened, at first skeptical, then silent as he realized the elegance of it. This was not the frantic imagination of a child, but the clear-eyed strategy of someone who had learned to survive by seeing what others missed. Eliza explained each step with care, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. She said they had been underestimated, that Sabrina and Miles believed Adrian too, blinded by trust, and her too young to matter. That underestimation was their greatest weapon, and they should use it. When she finished, Adrian sat back, stunned by the clarity of her thinking. He had built an empire with algorithms and foresight, yet here was a girl who had walked into his home with nothing but a blanket and a notebook, offering him a plan strong enough to fight betrayal. For the first time in days, he felt a spark of hope. The storm rolled in, heavy and fast, wind rattling against the tall glass walls, while rain drummed the roof in steady fury. Adrian stood in the entryway adjusting his coat, his movements loud enough for Sabrina to hear upstairs. He called out that he had a late meeting at the office, his tone weary but convincing, and she answered with practiced sweetness, telling him not to stay out too late. He opened the front door, let the storm swallow the sound of his car starting, then slipped quietly through the side entrance Josephine had left unlocked. The plan was set, and every second mattered. Upstairs, Eliza waited with Josephine in the hidden maids' quarters that now served as their observation post. The screens flickered with live feeds, the very cameras Sabrina had planted, now turned against her. Eliza leaned forward, her blanket pulled close, her eyes unblinking as she watched the woman glide into Adrian's study. Sabrina no longer carried the soft posture of a devoted fiancée. Her movements sharp, precise. The mask dropped at last. She closed the study door, pulled a sleek laptop from her designer bag, and connected it to Adrian's system with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed every step. Adrian stood behind the hidden panel with federal agents waiting in silence. His pulse steady, though, his chest burned with betrayal. He watched the monitors as Sabrina navigated the files he had planted earlier that afternoon. Documents filled with convincing formulas, but carrying the invisible watermark that would lead investigators straight to her handlers. She scrolled quickly, photographing some pages, downloading others, her lipstick bright against the pale glow of the screen. For months, he had believed her affection, yet here she was, exposed by the quiet vigilance of a child, and undone by her own arrogance. The storm outside masked the hum of the equipment as Sabrina transmitted the files to an encrypted server. Eliza whispered that the signal was live, her fingers moving across her tablet to trace the path. The agents nodded, recording everything, their radios silent but ready. The decoy server responded exactly as designed, feeding Sabrina what she thought was priceless, while in truth, it was leading her deeper into a trap from which there would be no escape. At 11:15, Sabrina leaned back with a satisfied sigh, sending one final message to Miles confirming the success. She began to pack her laptop when the study door opened, and Adrian stepped inside, flanked by 2 federal agents. For a heartbeat, her smile flickered back into place, but then the sight of their weapons, the badges, the grim certainty in Adrian's face wiped it away. She froze, her hand hovering above her bag, her eyes darting for an exit that did not exist. The agents moved swiftly, securing the laptop, reading her rights, documenting each device she had hidden in the room. Sabrina's voice broke into furious protests, then into pleas, then finally into silence as the storm howled outside. Eliza's eyes remained fixed on the screen, watching the trap she had helped design spring shut perfectly, the proof now undeniable. The storm had passed by morning, but inside the house the silence felt heavier than thunder. Adrian moved through the halls slowly, his footsteps echoing against the marble, every surface gleaming yet strangely lifeless. The federal agents were gone. Sabrina was in custody, and Miles would soon follow, yet the victory felt like ash in his mouth. Betrayal had not struck him with noise, it had left a hollow ache, a reminder that trust once broken did not mend easily. He poured himself a drink in the study, though he barely touched it, and stared at the empty chair where Sabrina had once laughed with effortless charm. The mask had fallen, and what remained was only the memory of how easily he had been fooled. He sat by the fire that evening, the flames low, the light flickering across his tired face. For a long time he thought he was alone, until he heard the soft shuffle of small feet. Eliza appeared, her blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders, her notebook clutched under one arm. She did not speak at first, only walked over to the chair beside him and climbed onto it, folding her legs beneath her. The firelight caught her eyes, making them seem older than her years, yet there was no hesitation in the way she settled next to him. Adrian glanced at her, uncertain of what to say, but she broke the silence with a simple truth. She said she did not regret speaking up, not even when he had doubted her, not even when it had hurt to see him look at Sabrina with faith. Her voice was steady, her words plain, yet they carried the weight of everything they had endured. Adrian felt something shift inside him, a slow uncoiling of the tightness he had carried since the first whisper of suspicion. He realized she had saved him not once, but again and again, each time risking the disappointment of not being believed. He told her he was proud of her, words that felt strange on his tongue, but true. She looked at him then, really looked, and he saw the flicker of a smile before she leaned closer, pulling the blanket around them both. For the first time in days, the house did not feel empty. They sat together in the glow of the fire, saying little, yet speaking in the quiet way only trust allowed. Eliza began to draw in her notebook, sketching the outline of the house, labeling the places where cameras had once been, her pencil moving with calm certainty. Adrian watched her, and instead of feeling hollow, he felt something unexpected rise, a resilience he had not known was possible. The betrayal had cut deep, but in its place grew a bond he could not have imagined when she first arrived at his gates. She looked up once more, and repeated softly that she had no regrets. He believed her, and in that moment he realized he did not either. The courthouse was nothing like Adrian's world of glass towers and private boardrooms. Its walls were plain, its benches worn from years of people waiting with hope or fear, its windows letting in thin light that gave no favor to wealth or name. Adrian sat straighter than usual at the wooden table, his suit pressed as always, yet his hands rested loosely in front of him, rather than folded in command. Beside him, Eliza sat with her blanket folded neatly in her lap, her hair brushed carefully that morning, her notebook tucked away in her backpack. She was quiet, but her eyes moved with their usual steady focus, taking in every detail of the room, the shuffle of papers, the coughs from a stranger, the way the judge adjusted his glasses. The process itself was simple on the surface. Documents reviewed, signatures placed, words spoken to confirm consent, yet every line carried weight heavier than any contract Adrian had signed in his career. This was not about money, or patents, or expansion. This was about permanence, about a promise that no storm, no betrayal, no whisper in the night could undo. When the clerk slid the final document across the table, Adrian reached for the pen without hesitation. His signature curved across the page with steady grace, his name binding him to a role he had not expected to carry yet, now could not imagine living without. The judge looked over his glasses at Eliza, his tone kind but formal, asking if she understood what this meant. Eliza nodded, her voice small but clear, saying she did. She said she had been waiting for a place that did not feel temporary, and that this one did. The words struck Adrian in a way no investor speech ever had. He felt the room fade until only her voice remained, a voice that carried both fragility and certainty, a voice that had saved him more than once. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the quiet courtroom. Just like that, the papers were more than ink and signatures. Eliza Monroe became Eliza Vale. Adrian's chest tightened as the name settled in the air, not as a formality but as truth. She glanced at him then, her eyes searching his, and for the first time he saw not only caution but relief, as if the long waiting had finally ended. They walked out together into the pale light of the morning, Josephine following a few steps behind with her steady smile. Outside the courthouse, the city moved as it always did, cars rushing, people hurrying, the world blind to the fact that his life had just been remade. Adrian looked down at Eliza, her hand tucked into his, and realized with sudden clarity that his greatest legacy would not be measured in profit margins or technology. It would be measured in the trust of a child who had chosen him. who had given him a family he had not known he needed until now. The drive back from the courthouse was quiet, but not heavy. The silence carried a kind of calm Adrian had not known before, a sense that the decision was sealed and the waiting over. Eliza sat in the back seat with her blanket folded neatly on her lap, her gaze fixed on the passing city lights. Josephine sat beside her, watching with the same gentle pride she had shown in the courtroom, her hands resting quietly as if to guard the moment. Adrian kept his eyes on the road, yet his thoughts circled the sound of the gavel, the name Vale, spoken aloud, the certainty of belonging that had been carved into law. When they arrived at the mansion, the doors opened not into the cavernous emptiness he had grown used to, but into a space already changed. It was the same house, the same polished marble, the same high ceilings, but something had shifted. Eliza carried her blanket upstairs without hesitation, walking with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer expected to be moved again. Adrian followed, pausing at her doorway as she spread the blanket across the foot of her bed. She smoothed it with small hands, her touch careful but sure, then stepped back to look at it as if seeing it for the first time. No longer wrapped around her shoulders as armor, no longer clutched against her chest as shield. It rested in place like a marker of arrival. Adrian stood there, his throat tightening. He remembered the night she first entered his home, soaked from the storm, how she had hidden behind its folds, how she had carried it from room to room, like the last fragile thread of safety she trusted. Now, it was no longer protection against a world that had failed her. It was a symbol of something they had built together, a reminder that she no longer needed to defend herself alone. He turned and walked through the halls, noticing what had changed. The paintings no longer looked like distant trophies, but frames in a home where voices now echoed. The library smelled faintly of crayons from Eliza's notebook. The dining table carried the memory of her careful laughter when Josephine told stories, and even the empty study, once tainted by betrayal, now felt like a place of resilience. Wealth had given him walls, glass, and stone, but wealth had never given him warmth. That had come from a child who had taught him to listen, to watch, to trust. That evening, as the fire glowed in the hearth, Eliza curled up with her notebook beside him, Josephine knitting quietly in the chair across the room. The house was no longer hollow. It breathed with a rhythm of belonging, a family woven not by blood but by choice. Adrian looked at Eliza and thought of the certificate that bore her new name, but it was the folded blanket at the foot of her bed that told the deeper truth. He finally had a home because she had given it to him. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.